customary, let me formally introduce them, and then we'll get into discussing the budget and what is their point of view on how effective the budget has been in keeping up with the aspirations of all stakeholders. So, we've had two gentlemen who represent the legal fraternity, but they also represent people who understand tax, both direct and indirect taxes, really well. We also have a corporate point of view in a GC who represents a technology company. So let me welcome all the three guests and my editorial colleague Krishnendra Joshi. Let me start by welcoming Mr. Lakshmikumaran Sitaraman. Mr. Lakshmikumaran doesn't really need an introduction, and he's been an advisor to the government. I'm sure when it comes to new areas of taxation, it comes to new frontiers, and it comes to making policy changes, his views are sought. Welcome, Mr. Lakshmikumaran Sitaraman. Thank you. Look forward to your inputs on how effective the budget has been. Let me also welcome Mr. Mukesh Butani, who again doesn't really need an introduction. He's a very prolific writer, and he also wrote post the budget that this is a budget for the next 25 years to build in India at 100. And my question would be, yes, we must look at a 25-year horizon, but how effective is it in the next 12 to 24 months? That's a question that we will ask. And last but not the least, let me welcome Ms. Kalindee Mehta, who's the Vice President and the General Counsel for SAP in Asia Pacific. So we have a corporate viewpoint and we have two legal practitioners. So let me start by asking you, Ms. Kalindee Mehta, what has been your initial reaction to the budget, and do you think it fulfills the expectations of all the stakeholders, especially the business stakeholders?
So, Dr. Batra, thank you so much for the question, and it's my privilege to be here with two very learned, panelists. So, I think when we look at what the budget came up with, right? There were a lot of eyes on what's going to come out because we are straight coming from the two very horrid years of pandemic. The economy has really been impacted. A lot of livelihood has been impacted, and corporates have seen ups and downs. There's disruption from the technology side. Startups are booming. So it's a very kind of a mixed, external situation. And I think this budget is trying to address a lot of those areas. Some good, some not so good. But a very good attempt has been made to look at, how we want to look at our future of India. Where is the economy headed? What is our strategy? What are the big rocks, and how we are going to get where we need to reach? So if I have to look at the whole roadmap that's being built, right? I mean, on the 25 years vision, to me personally, that's very long, and I don't think anybody can have that foresight. Even corporates these days plan for 7 years of vision, but it's good to have that clarity that look, we want to expand on the capital expenditure, we want to build capacity, we want to improve our infrastructure, and these are the benefits that corporates can look forward to. So overall, I think very positive, gives us hope to look forward in the next 12 to 24 months.
You're on mute, Anurag.
I'll unmute myself as a practice. I mute myself when somebody's speaking. But let me say that one has been fiscally prudent, and there are two ways to look at it. One, that it is a big election year because there's the election in UP, but the Lok Sabha elections are in 2024. There is also a thought process that the goodies will come in 2023 and 2024. And right now the schemes are being seeded, which will start giving dividends, so to say, in 23 and 24. That's one thought, but let me bring in Mr. Mukesh Bhutani for his opening comment. Mr. Bhutani, you recently wrote a piece where you said it's a visionary budget and it looks ahead. But as a famous economist said, in the long term, we are all dead. Okay, hopefully you, me, and Mr. we all will be alive over the next 25 years and look forward to many more budgets. But what is the short-term objectives that the government is trying to meet through the budget?
So, thank you first, Anurag, for inviting me, and it's a privilege to share diets with Lakshmi sir, and pleasure meeting Kalindee as well. Let's look at the context, external factors which are beyond India's control. Number one, the world GDP is going to go down in 2022 compared to 2021, because 2021 there was a bouncing of base impact of 2020 COVID crisis. Two, the world for the first time is suffering inflationary pressure. Imagine an inflation of 5 to 7% in the United States. Three, crude oil prices have touched a 8-year high. These are three factors that are going to impact India significantly. And what do we have in India? A recovery which was one in 21-22 marked by the second wave, and we still do not know the impact of the third wave in the current fiscal year. So a lot of uncertainty. So what has the government done? The government has followed a very simple 1920s professor economist Keynes principle. Let the government spend and everything will fall in place. Now, it is debatable whether crowding in of government expenditure by way of capex is going to encourage private enterprises to invest more, or it is going to invest less. If I look at what Mr. Chidambaram said yesterday, that the capex increase is going to crowd out private investment and not crowd in, because the government is going to borrow from the market, which is going to leave less money for the private sector to borrow, or it will leave money at higher rates of interest. So I think it's a bet, it's a hope, it's an expectation. But this hope and expectation is on the back of 2-3 positive factors for India. Number one, the buoyancy in tax collection that we saw in the current fiscal year, or we are witnessing in the current fiscal year. Two, large corporates, at least reporting the last quarter results, seem very optimistic. Three, a rise in business confidence. Four, formalization of the economy. So there are these headwinds that are there, largely external factors, and there are the positives for India as well. The last point is encouraging domestic manufacturing and revamping of the SEZs, in my view, are going to be other playouts. Of course, there are some very, very big new ideas in the budget that we can talk about, but this is really my opening that gives me a hope, even in the short to medium term, for a decent growth rate.
While you're an optimist and you're looking positive, when we get into the nuances of what has been announced in the budget, I'd also like you to comment on what could have been better. What are the areas that have been left out? What could have been better? So while I welcome the budget too, and especially you talked about inflation, and I'll want to ask you a question on that, because my view is that economies are doing well, but the politics of leaders are doing so well, they're not worried that much about economies across the world, because they're winning politics. So economy is important, but when you're winning, it is little less important. So I'll come to that, but let me bring in Mr. Lakshmikumaran to make his opening comments on what is your broad overview of the budget 2022, and does the budget meet your expectations and the expectations of the stakeholders? Mr. Lakshmikumaran.
Thank you, sir. I think continuing what Mukesh has said, and also what Kalindee mentioned, I see that this budget is another positive budget. For the reason, first of all, it left the corporate and individual with no changes on taxation, personal taxation. That's a very big thing under these circumstances. Whether it is the lower income or higher income, middle income, etc., they are by and large, they are not been touched. That's one of the important things. so that things can continue. But what I found very important here is the focus on the MSMEs and Microsoft small companies. There is a big outlay, and that is a sector which is providing huge employment to the people. And the focus given to them is very encouraging. And if there are no leakages, and if the benefit actually goes to them, we can definitely see a very good revival as far as the economy is concerned, as far as that particular thing and employment. And as usual, there has been some revenue measures by taxing the cryptocurrencies. We'll come back a little later on that particular thing, because a lot of things to be said on that. But I would say that given the constraints, given the uncertainties, I think the Honorable Finance Minister has done the right way of keeping the middle path and not giving to either side, left or right, and then maintained a very good balance. Under the circumstances, she had done a great job. So that's what my preliminary comments at this point of time, Anurag. You are on mute.
Now, let me start with you. And you made the point that the fact is the government spent on whether it was the food scheme during the 22 months of Corona, or whether it's the vaccination program, which has been effective. There's no question about that now. I mean, and not to tax after spending that is a big, I think a lot of people have missed that. The expectation in the budget is always there'll be reductions, but sometimes you have to keep the environment in mind. Let me start by asking you, Mr. Lakshmikumaran, this time. There's been an attempt to bring in the crypto tax, if I may call it, right? How do you think it will impact the landscape? What are the pros of it? What are the cons of it?
Let's put it this way. The trading in the cryptocurrencies is happening so much, the government just cannot ignore it. Certainly, it does not have the respect of a legal tender or a currency. So therefore, it has to be treated differently, like any other asset, not as a currency. What should be the roadmap for the regulation of this particular trading of these assets, digital assets they are called, is a step to be done, and probably the government is working on that. It may take its own time. The question is not whether we should legitimize the cryptocurrencies or not. It's a different question. I mean, what way to regulate is more important as far as the resident and non-resident as far as India is concerned. But I think the finance minister has looked at it from a two different angle. As I think Mr. ASG put it across yesterday, one is legal and another one is moral. As the legal is concerned, they take cognizance of the large volume of trade of this, and the government wants to take its pie, and therefore they said we will tax it. We'll discuss the actual taxation a little later. But at the same time, they also said any expenditure towards that will not be given, and it will not be set off again other losses. That is the moral side. Very nicely put yesterday when Raman put it across. So therefore, this is not a regulation of the cryptocurrencies. Pending that, whatever happens later, the gains, the capital gains of the trading in these cryptocurrencies is to be taxed. That's what I think it has been done at this particular point of time.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Bringing it into they've treated it as an asset rather than a currency, to make that distinction.
Correct.
You're trying to make, and that's the right. Now, I'd like to ask you a very direct question. Is this a budget? Is it an aspirational budget, or it's an achievable budget? We media people like to put, simple things to complex things sometimes. And my colleague, Mr. Krishnendra Joshi, has will dwell into this further. But what do you think? For example, let's look at the tax proposal. The thrust of the tax proposal in the budget is to simplify processes and reduce litigation. However, the budget has also introduced provisions for broadening the basis of information on which reassessments can be initiated, while expanding the scope of reassessments to cover expenditure. What is your take?
Sir, you put a right question, whether aspirational or achievable. I think when we are looking at the future, we have to definitely aim for something. The aim should be more than what normally would have been achieved. Let us put it this way. I mean, if we do it every day in your home, your own budget also, you would like to do that. But achievability, with all the modern tools the government has, and they are sitting on a huge amount of data. So therefore, it is possible for them to identify where the leakages are or what should be done, etc. It's possible. And the enormous amount of data and data analytics is taking place behind us. But what is important is to educate and empower the field officers to use those tools most effective manner. But when you give the power to them with all the other incidental things, we have seen in the past that the power is being misused. And more important thing is the government or the authorities take a very aggressive position, sometimes mostly untenable positions, leaving the assessees with no choice but to litigate. And that's the sad part of the entire thing. So what is important is, apart from the so-called simplifications or bringing the modern tools, etc., etc. Some of this assessment, like face assessment, is a good concept as such. But the way it is being implemented or likely to be implemented, and the field office not being ready for that, and not taking a position which is in line with the judicial pronouncements, that is where the gap is, and the gap is very big. So therefore, if you ask me whether the litigation is likely to come down, my answer is definitely no. Unless we change the attitude, the way in which the tax authorities look at the tax assessees, this is not likely to. I'm not taking for a moment that those assessees who are tax dodgers and tax evaders, I mean, they need to be punished with the heavy hand. The more and more they don't make payments of taxes legitimately due to the government, you and I are paying more. That's, I think, is unfair. But then there is another class of assessees who are compliant, who pay the taxes correctly on time. But if by interpretation, if the government takes a very extreme position and not compromising on that, that is where the problem comes in, where the courts are getting clogged. I don't know whether budget can ever change those types of attitudes. Therefore, to your question regarding the reduction of litigation, I have a very big question mark. It is not done through the budget. It is done through the training, attitudinal changes, not through the budget.
Thank you. And I may just say that technology solves a lots of problems. It provides solutions. It provides an objective assessment. But technology may not be always right. The last Australian Open final is artificial intelligence. After the two sets predicted a certain outcome, while the outcome was exactly the opposite. So sometimes technology does not factor the power of human thinking, resilience. In this case, there is a human error also possible, right? So,
just to add on to what you said, Anurag, today there are enough number of software tools available, at least in the US, at least some major litigations. The AI tool can predict what is likely to be the judgment. And the funding is done by various companies for funding the litigations, etc., based on those results. But here again, they are not always right.
Yes, absolutely. Now let me go to Mr. Bhutani. Mukesh, let me now ask you the same question. Your thoughts on the crypto taxation regime. Is it a welcome move or is it a deterrent for the growth of young India?
It's a welcome move for the following reasons. Uh, Number one, typically our regulatory framework precedes the tax framework. In this case, it's the other way around. So we've got the tax framework first, and then we'll deal with the regulatory framework. Two, I felt that crypto or dealing in crypto is considered as a taboo in India. At least that would not be, because there is basis for taxation now. Three, I also feel it sends out a very strong signal that India is open to new forms of embracing new forms of innovation in technology, because crypto is not just about making money on a crypto exchange, but the entire crypto blockchain technology can help you deliver services much more better and much more efficiently. Uh, Fourthly, the back and forth between the RBI, the court, the statements that were made by in the government, from banning crypto to welcoming crypto, at least that debate. So I think that the announcement of the crypto tax, in my view, paves way for establishing a regulatory mechanism. Now, whether it's highly regulated uh, or restrictive, only time will prove that. But I think it's a very important signal. The only thing that I felt let down was the total rate of tax on crypto assets. I felt that the applying the maximum marginal rate of tax with all the other conditions of no set off and against other income and so on and so forth, seemed that crypto is now on par with speculation income. As we know, speculation income, India has been taxing for the last several decades at the maximum marginal rate of tax and subjecting it to the same restrictions. That is something which I felt was a downer. But overall, I think signaling crypto tax is a positive move.
Absolutely. So it is an asset and people will have to declare it. And hopefully, as you said, the regulatory work, regulatory clarity will also in due course of time come. So it's a welcome step in that sense. Let me ask my last question to Ms. Mehta, and then I'll bring in Mr. Krishnendra Joshi. Ms. Mehta, one of the things that has happened in the last 22 months is our sensitivity towards sustainability, towards ESG. You think with the government coming into a becoming carbon neutral, has the budget fulfilled expectations on the ESG front? Are the tax and non-tax incentives adequate to put corporate India on a path to a greener economy?
Thank you so much, Dr. Batra, for posing this question to me. I think, even as an organization, ICP is very, very passionate about sustainability, and we are doing a lot of work on this side. Now, I think, let's zoom out of the budget scenario and look at why sustainability is very important, right? We are realizing that our carbon emission and the way we are consuming fuel and the energy is so high that if we don't start monitoring it and controlling it now, we will not leave a better world for our future generation. And I think last year our government came up with a notification that all the top 1,000 listed companies will have to disclose their ESG parameters. Now, ESG is not just about environment; it's also considering the broader societal and your governance criteria. But keeping this conversation in terms of what is sustainability and the carbon emission and how we control it, I think it's a very, very welcome move. The government has said that they are going to issue sovereign green bonds to enable carbon reduction. There are regulations which are going to mandate organizations to disclose what is their consumption, and therefore at least sensitize them to do something on the reduction path. There is an entire ecosystem that's being developed around the electric vehicle batteries. There are policies on battery swapping. Interoperability standards are yet to be finalized, but we are definitely on the right track. But I think as Lakshmi sir said before, right? A lot of this will also depend on how we are going to execute this. And, is it only like a nice to do thing, or will we at some point in time make it punitive? Right now, it's more of, if you are doing it, excellent, you get a lot of goodie points. There's also a, credit rating, which is linked to your ESG compliance. Your cost of capital goes down. So there are a lot of incentives for being on the right hand side. But how are we going to pull the entire ecosystem? Because if we talk about the, just the electric vehicles and the batteries, there is a huge capital investment required to change the entire ecosystem of that, right? As a consumer, you and I will have to change our cars from, the fuel to the battery cars. How are we going to make that massive transition, especially in the light of the economy that we are living today, coming out of pandemic, the challenges that are already facing us? So yeah, we'll have to see how we actually execute this. But in terms of reforms, I think it's a very welcome move. And
Okay.
even in terms of the data center, right? I mean, and I'll show you how it's also linked to sustainability. So the government has said that, data center will be now considered as a critical infrastructure, and therefore it opens doors to all the funding and the credit. But data center also uses a lot of energy. So for example, a lot of hyperscalers like, the Microsoft Azure or AWS or Google Cloud Platform, they use the renewable source of energy, but there is no condition attached on the infrastructure that, you will be incentivized provided you use an alternate renewable source of energy. So yeah, but still, considering what we could have done, we are much better.
Okay, let me bring in Mr. Joshi at this point of time. Krishnendra, you, Mr. Lakshmikumaran, Mr. Mukesh Butani, and Ms. Kalindee Mehta. Go ahead, ask your set of questions. Krishnendra, go ahead, ask your set of questions.
Yeah, so my question is for Lakshmi sir. You had recently authored an article on India's move to roll back the retrospective tax levy. Now, how would you rate the budget 2022 in terms of making India a global investment destination?
See, global destination for India as a destination for the global investments, etc., is a very larger question. One of the factor is stability in law and stability in jurisprudence. There are so many other things also, other factors. Let me elaborate on this particular factor of this so-called stability in law. What the global investors are looking for is a speedy judicial system whereby the judgments are delivered faster and the government respects it. It may be in favor or against. As far as the first part is concerned, we are way behind as far as the time taken for the pronouncement of the judgments. And the reason for that is, again, the huge number of litigations. And I must say, with all humility at my command, that the government is one of the major litigants in the entire process. According to me, at least 50 to 60% of the litigation need not have come to the courts at all. That is a huge number, but it is there what it is. But what we have seen in the present budget in the past, but especially this present budget, is a number of legislation have been made with retrospective effect. Number of them. And they are, in fact, they have done it in two different ways. One, directly saying it is indeed retrospective. I make an amendment, I make retrospective by clear words. There are amendments also made by saying explanation and for removal of doubts. That would mean that this is the intention of the government. It is always the intention of the government. And therefore, courts and the authorities look at this intention as a guide for you to decide. So that would mean that the amendments made are clarificatory in nature, and therefore retrospective by application. There were two different ways of doing it. And I also found one more interesting thing, rather disturbing, is in the past, the parliament steps in wherever the highest court of India has delivered a judgment which will result in huge losses of revenue to the government, and then they step in and they cure the defect and give retrospective legislation and validate the law. But the recent budget has seen that even the decision of the tribunals or the high courts, they step in and then say, this is our intention by clarification. So now, again, we could say the retrospective legislation could be of 2 or 3 different kinds. One, an interpretation of a law, of a provision, which definitely leads to the or substantial provision of law which leads to huge losses, like in your case of your Vodafone case, for example, if you can put it, where the government steps in or the parliament steps in and amend retrospectively. Fortunately, the present government has removed the retrospectivity portion of that. But there are also amendments which are procedural in nature, which will be retrospective. That, for example, today in this case, we will find that the Supreme Court judgment in the case of Canon, which said that the DRA officers do not have the power to issue the show cause notices. And the parliament has stepped in and then they have moved, or at least the bill moves to amend the law retrospectively, actually from 1962, from at all material times. So now, government will definitely have a lot of reasons for validating all the notices issued. I am not saying no. Then the other question will be whether these amendments are good enough or not. Is a bigger question. We'll see later at that relevant point of time. But from an investor's point of view, when he sees so many amendments made, many of them retrospective effect and retroactive effect, they will question whether the government respects the judgments of the courts or not. There's a bigger question which is always in the mind of the investors. If this is one of the important factors for them to come for investment in India, that the dampening effect. I would say, put it that way, there's a dampening effect.
Okay, you've been very direct about it. To KJ's question, KJ, I hope our viewers and as well as you got an answer to that, and I don't think anybody would disagree with that, even people who are policymakers and are in the government, because eventually it improves the ease of doing business. Eventually, if your policy risks are mitigated and there is policy consistency of the right kind, then it brings its own rewards, it brings its own dividends, more investments, policy clarity and policy consistency will always help. That's the point. And thank you for being so direct. Mr. Bhutani and Ms. Mehta, let me ask you a question before we bring in KJ again. For at least 2 decades that I've been looking at the budget, it is being debated whether an expenditure tax is the right way. I mean, in the last decade, we call it the expenditure tax. There's been this discussion on doing away with the income tax. Do you think it will happen over the next few years? It didn't happen in this budget. Do you think it's a good idea? It's a bad idea? It's an impractical idea? Mr. Bhutani?
I think it's an impractical idea because you take horizontal equity, vertical equity as the tax economists look at taxation as a source of revenue for the government. It is there. Countries where taxation of income was not allowed because of religious laws, particularly in many jurisdictions in the Middle East, even they have started talking about taxes. I think what is important here is a mix of taxes. Historically, our consumption taxes have not occupied as much center stage as the income taxes. So I think that's one thing that we are getting it right. And GST, in my view, for all the other reasons, becomes a landmark reform to get that test right. Of course, the debate is at what rate are you taxing? But I think the debate on GST settles that the more and more goods and services we get at a median rate of 15.5 to 16% considered as a median rate, I think we will not have these exorbitant 28+% taxes on goods such as cars and air conditioners. The second debate is on income taxes. I think the income tax debate is slightly more nuanced. What to tax, how to tax, and what should be the basis for taxation. I would like to believe that our businesses now are moderately taxed insofar as income tax is concerned. 25% is a median rate, which means that the only ask is, why are you discriminating services? Because today only manufacturing, other than new manufacturing at 15%, only manufacturing is taxed at 25%, rest of the businesses are taxed at 30%. Which brings us to the non-business taxation rate. I think the 3 or 4 or 5 rates of surcharges that we have, which pushes the maximum marginal rate of tax on individuals to 42%, is, in my view, painfully high and doesn't resonate very well. Though there are many of the economists who have again started talking about the debate. 147 people in our country control close to $1 trillion or so of income. Well, not income, wealth, I would say. And shouldn't there be a case for levy of wealth tax and inheritance tax? I'm leaving that controversial debate on the side because I have some very different views on taxation in India, and it should be kept simplistic and minimalistic towards the end. So just to round off, Dr. Batra, I think that we have a reasonable tax regime, which is getting stabilized, but over the years, you will see that the consumption taxes will assume more center stage insofar as collection is concerned, because the cost of collecting consumption taxes for the government are lower as compared to income tax. And we are fairly moderate insofar as our rates of taxation are concerned, other than the aberrations that are pointed out on individuals and services sector.
Mukesh, let me ask you, where did the budget shortfall of expectations, and I'm not going into the, the citizens expecting a lower rate of interest, taxation, but what are the other expectations which were there to either kickstart the economy? Of course, infrastructure spending is the biggest kickstarter because it will have a multiplier impact, and its impact also creates new economic centers, which in turn add to GDP. So that's, but what do you think should have been done more?
The household segment, particularly low taxpayers or pensioners, that includes my mother as well. Every year they expect a change in the slab rates. And the whole philosophy for change in slab rates is that you put more income in the hands, and most of that income that gets saved also gets spent because the demand is very high. And that kind of leads into a cyclical positive impact on the economy. There were a lot of expectations in this year's budget. One, because there has been a fairly high degree of unemployment, particularly in the unorganized sector, small and medium enterprises. Middle class pensioners have been reeling under the inflationary pressure, though it is debatable on the wholesale price index versus the consumer price index, but the inflation impact has been high. The government philosophy not to tinker with the slab rate changes, which will impact those class of taxpayers, is predicated on one assumption. Historically, a lot of criticism that India, a country of 1.4 billion people, which is not taxing agriculture income, has very few taxpayers. Now, the moment you tinker around with the slab rate changes, you will have few million taxpayers just leaving the tax net. And that is regressive from a tax policy perspective, which is aiming at increasing the number of taxpayers in the country. So this is a dilemma that consecutive governments, consecutive finance ministers have been dealing with. But that's an area where I felt that the voice from the common man and the rhetoric was that they were let down by this year's budget because the finance minister did not carry out any slab rate changes.
Okay, Ms. Mehta, my last question to you before I again bring in Mr. Joshi. Now, one of the biggest tools for the government to create new economic centers is infrastructure. Whether you build roadways, you build highways, you build airports at smaller centers of economic activity, you build more railways, you build waterways in certain cases. So infrastructure has been the headline of the budget, so to say. But tell me, in your assessment, what are the areas where the budget could have done more?
I think you're so right that, the current budget is only about, building capital infrastructure, capacity, utilization. I think they have done a fair bit of job in, rolling out the spectrum auction for 5G services, data centers, building roads and connectivities, which will definitely help the industry because, if you have these logistics set up, it somewhere balances out your cost of transporting goods and everything else. But I think what we could have also done is, how are we giving some impetus to organizations which are, generating mass employment, enable the private organizations who will also do, chime in role to support the government in terms of spending. So, for example, we have a lot of public procurement policies that needs to be looked into. When government is procuring technology, there are so many now regimes around it. We are making it very strict in terms of, data localization. India is a very large consumer of our bandwidth, right? So we are the largest consumer. Data center, of course, is a very, very welcoming change because we can also become the hosting partners for other countries, because while a lot of countries are saying they would need localization, but they also need the disaster recovery sites and they need alternate availability zones. So all of that can happen. I think it needs more depth than what has been given. I think in the other setup, how are we also investing into the skills, right? So we are talking about an entire disruption of economy. Data center will not just come by itself. It will need, expertise of privacy experts, your security experts, people who can handle, the technology complexities of that nature. So how are we investing into education? We are looking at, the entire, great resignation. People are wanting to have more quality of life. Pandemic has taught us that you could have whatever amount of money, but if you don't have a good health, you are not going to succeed with what you have. So how are we trying to, build up all of these skills, talent, and, have medical infrastructure on the health side of it? We have certain shortcomings in the budget as well, which could have been taken care of to balance it out eventually.
Absolutely. KJ, your questions to Mr. Lakshmikumaran and Mr. Bhutani.
So my question is, Mr. Bhutani briefly touched upon the MSME sector in his opening remarks. Will budget prove to be an effective revival pill for the sector?
Well, there are many proposals in the budget that tend to address the woes of MSME, primarily because besides the revival of the MSME businesses, I think here the government has more at stake because it is battling with an issue called unemployment, and MSME continues to be the highest source of unemployment, the highest source of employment, sorry. So there is a lot in the budget for MSMEs. I defer the expert opinion on this to Lakshmi sir as being country's foremost trade lawyer as well. But I'd just like to mention 2-3 things which could, in my view, play out in the medium to long term. Number one, the new manufacturing rate, which is for everyone. They don't discriminate between manufacturers, small and medium enterprise. There is an extension of 1 year because government recognizes that COVID has delayed large manufacturing setups. The two is the wider outlook of the tariffs review. 2021 Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman made the announcement to review it. That review is completed, and there is a graded basis of removal of these exemptions. That is a larger part of the outlook. I think, in my view, the much awaited would be the foreign trade policy as well, because the foreign trade policy could throw in certain aspects to encourage domestic manufacturing. And of course, then there are other issues on financing of small and medium enterprises, liquidity issues, which are there in every budget fine print. I haven't looked at it specifically, anything in this year's budget as such, but it's one of the other prominent features that are there. I think the third aspect, which not specifically mentioned, goes back to the point that Lakshmi sir was making in the past, that we don't need legislation. We need a good administration of the legislation. Small and medium enterprises do not have the luxury to afford expensive accountants and lawyers. They don't have the bandwidth of teams to be able to deal with approvals, red tape, bureaucracy. I think they need a simplified. So I think, when you're talking about ease of doing business index, actually they benefit the most because they need it more than large enterprises, given the fact that the large enterprises have the strength of the balance sheet and the bandwidth of resources and access to expensive resources, which they don't have it. So I think this goes back to the point that was being made earlier. You need to address that much more faster.
Sir, would you like to add?
Yeah, in fact, I wanted to ask some questions to my friend Bhutani. And I can always ask him in the private, but I think it is better that the audience also get his benefit. I was always wondering, Mukesh, this 15% tax or 16% tax is what ultimately Chanakya wrote in his Arthashastra. And in fact, to my surprise, I found, I wasn't surprised, I was very pleasantly surprised when I found a sloka in Valmiki Ramayana also talks about the same 1/6%. Therefore, Arthashastra, what we thought what is written is now dating back to Valmiki. Probably he was also taking from Manudharma Shastra. In any case, I think let us not go into that. But if you look at the OECD and other countries, they're saying that minimum taxation of 15% is what is being contemplated. And that is very close to 1/6. That is one. The same thing which I wanted to say is, while MSME sectors is talking about manufacturing and where the 15% tax to the new companies or new manufacturing units starting as commercial production before 2024 will enjoy the 15%. Why the service sector is left out? Why MSME status is not given to service sector? And there are lots and lots of people who are already or want to start the services. And why the MSME concessions or any benefit, etc., is not extended to the service sector, while India always feels that it could become the world capital of the services, if not the manufacturing. I am not able to understand the reason for the distinction. Would you like to throw some light on that?
So that is clearly a dichotomy, as you correctly pointed out. And to me, it's a big puzzle. And it's a big puzzle because if I put my hat as a tax economist, not that I'm a trained economist, the first principle for taxation is that the rate of tax is agnostic to the form of business, which means that whether you are an individual or a partnership firm or a company, whether you are in manufacturing or in services, there should be no discrimination. Now, perception or obsession, whatever you call it, somewhere there is a feeling that, only manufacturing can create jobs. And I think it's either a perception or wrong thinking. But I entirely support that services sector should also be given the tax rate. In fact, as a matter of fact, the services sector make out a more compelling case for a reduced rate of tax. For example, 15% for a new manufacturing and 25%. Because if you just look at the basket of services contribution in the overall GDP, that itself is a compelling case, number one. Number two, we know historically we have had serious challenges on manufacturing, whether this got to do with logistics or it's got to do with our manufacturing units not spreading out in the semi-urban and the non-urban areas of the country. It's got to do with approvals and red tape, challenges on land acquisition, so on and so forth. In fact, services, it's much more easier to get a services business kickstart. I wanted to also tell you the story of families and friends. You go and check with any of your family and friends who don't live in the metropolitan cities and they had manufacturing units. You'd be surprised to know that more than 5, and if not more, out of 10 businesses are closed.
Correct.
They're closed because manufacturing has become unviable. 2, they're closed because the younger generation doesn't believe that manufacturing is the way. They've actually quit family businesses and come to cities looking out for job. They've actually gone to family and say, please give me capital. I want to set up a BPO. And hence, I think we should, as a nation, get over this thinking, or rather we should, as a policy making arm, get over the thinking that there is something sacred about manufacturing which is not there in services.
Yeah, this was always puzzling me. Thank you for, I think you're also sharing my own views. And there are a number of entrepreneurs who would like to. And one more thing also, we found that because of the present tax structure, etc., many of the service providers, for example, the service providers earn a lot of foreign exchange. Sitting from here, there are lots of people who are teaching the school students in US and UK or
Correct.
Europe from here.
Correct.
They're retired teachers, so many people, and then they get their money in foreign exchange.
Correct.
Now, the taxation of that is the highest. And I think that is where I think somewhere it is pinching. As we rightly put, is the tax rate should be agnostic to the business which we do, etc., whether manufacturing or etc. I suppose somebody is listening to what you are saying. Yes. No.
That was very, very insightful between two great lawyers. I would just like to wrap up with quick comments on what is your bucket list for the coming 2-3 years, let's say. I'll start with you, Ms. Mehta.
So, Krishnendra, if I have to cast for the bucket list, I think the first and foremost item on my agenda would be, reduction in the tax rate for the salaried class. I am one of them, and I see a lot of colleagues around me. And, it seems that, the government really believes that you can keep on taxing income tax, all the, surcharges, consumption tax, and this class will continue to pay. To me, this is also one of the reasons for the brain drain, right? Because you are taxing somebody so much that they feel that it's much better to probably pay the same level of tax, but then to have a much better infrastructure, much better overall quality of life. So that's one of the things. We are just coming out of, the whole pandemic, right? So maybe it would be nice if healthcare can get a little more budget allocation. I think, even on the education side, I feel we really need to upskill our young population to make sure that they are employable, they get the right kind of jobs, and, they are out there in the world to shine the brightest. So that's what could be on my top bucket list. Of course, I love the spend on infrastructure and everything that's happening in the current budget.
Lakshmi, sir?
Yeah, I think I don't advocate for any new bucket list. The existing bucket list, what has been done in this budget, the expenditure, infrastructure, etc., if it is spent without leakage, it's a great thing. And as far as the taxation is concerned, if the present policy of not tinkering with the rates, in spite of the fact, I think the slab rates could definitely be much more liberalized. But the more important thing is the implementation. And if the right attitude is now being adopted by the tax authorities, many litigations can be avoided. And only the relevant litigations involving tax dodges alone will be in the court. And then the courts will be more than happy to dispose of those matters. We have competent judges, competent courts, etc. Unfortunately, each judge is having a board of more than 100 cases a day. It is a pity how they ever manage. If only we can reduce by 50%, I think the quality of judgments and the speedy judgment will take place. Nothing more. We don't need anything else. Just change our attitude. That's it.
Mr. Bhutani?
Well, I echo Lakshmi's view. If I may have to expand it, I would just use a little bit of philosophy. As a nation and as a race, we are never short of innovation and creativity, whether in civil society or in the government. We have great ideas. But I think where we don't perform very well is in the execution, which Lakshmi sir is emphasizing upon. But just looking at the sound bites in the budget and in the recent past, I would just lay down my list to include first, as a lawyer, implement what the Supreme Court E-Courts Committee has recommended, Justice Chandrachud's committee, because there were meetings with the Niti Aayog as well, which is modernize the court system, boost digital infrastructure, and make adjudication process as technical compliant. These were the headlines. Now, if I look at the budget document on expenditure, which is a special budgetary allocation, I felt that this initiative was missing. As a matter of fact, the overall budget allocation for upgrading the court system has come down. So that's been a little normal for me. So we are saying something, but we are doing something else. And this also will help, implement the faceless assessment scheme very well, though the budgets for the faceless assessment scheme, which is the budget of the Department of Revenue, is different. Re-endorse the national litigation policy. Just don't talk about national litigation policy when there is a crisis. Make use of it, talk about it, revise the targets every day. I mean, it should be visible in the entire hierarchy of the system that the national litigation policy is not just a research report throwing out statistics, but it is actually working to improve it and make an assessment regularly that we are doing the right thing. I also feel that we should be now more agile in doing the regulatory framework for crypto, now that we have made the announcement, and some of the other things that we've been talking about on drones and NFTs and others. I think we are doing very well. Again, from an ease of doing business standpoint, I just have two small wish lists. Again, sound bites are relevant. We have a mediation bill of 2021, which last year was tabled in the parliament. Everybody is talking about litigation and the importance of this bill to encourage and promote institutional mediation. So we've spoken enough and we've carried out enough changes to the Arbitration Act. Let's look at mediation, which provides, in my view, the pre-mediation litigation facility as well. I know it's been referred to the Standing Committee of the Parliament just 10 days back, but I think I'd like to see that as well. Also, the Finance Minister made an announcement on CPACE, the Center for Processing Accelerated Corporate Exits, in 6 months' time, which will require enabling changes to the IBC code as well. I think, again, that's a fantastic initiative because we know 70% of the IBC cases have taken over 280 days for resolution. So I think if we take these few small steps, in my view, which are really low-hanging fruits, and strengthen our execution, I think we would be much better off a year from now when we are looking at the next year's budget.
So execution holds the key, and thank you for your wonderful insights and practical wisdom. I'm sure the audience would have gained from so much knowledge sharing, and we look forward to having you again for another panel. So we are just closing this panel now. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good
Thank
luck,
you.
everyone.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Mukesh. Thank you, Rima.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.